When I dumped the bucket of ice water on Adrian Cole's $3,000 suit at the most expensive restaurant in Brickell, I already knew exactly where my daughter was hiding. If you're listening to me now, if you've ever tasted metal in your mouth when someone humiliates you in public, if you've ever had to swallow your anger to avoid losing a job that barely pays the bills, then you'll understand every word I'm about to say. Because this story isn't just mine. It's about all of us who one day must choose between dignity and survival. My name is Elena Reyes. I'm 38 years old, with hands calloused from wiping Italian marble, and perfect pitch that cost me 16 years of conservatory school and has earned me exactly $0 in the last 3. Classical pianist turned janitor, single mother turned ghost, woman who once helped a bankrupt mechanic become a billionaire and now mops the floor beneath his feet. It was a Friday in March. I remember because the Cipriani ballroom was packed for the launch of some tech startup. I was on my knees in the east corner, the one near the bay windows, scrubbing champagne stains some drunk executive had spilled 3 hours earlier. My hands burned. The mixture of hospital-grade disinfectant and hot water left my skin red and cracked, but I couldn't wear gloves because the manager said they left marks on the marble. So there I was, dipping the fingers that had once touched Rachmaninoff into chemicals that dissolved my fingerprints. The mirrored room magnified everything. Dozens of Elenas kneeling, dozens of men in tuxedos laughing too loudly, dozens of waiters milling about with silver trays. I could see my reflection in the floor I'd just cleaned, hair pulled back in a tight bun, gray scrubs 2 sizes too big, white hospital sneakers that squeaked when I moved. Nothing remained of the woman I was. Nothing except my ear. Because right there, even on my knees, even invisible, I could hear everything. The sound of clinking glasses had an A-flat frequency. Footsteps on the marble echoed in rhythmic patterns that my brain automatically cataloged. And the voice, always his voice. Adrian Cole walked across the room, talking to someone about acquisitions and the Asian market, and every syllable that came out of his mouth pierced me like a needle. I knew that voice. I knew it better than anyone in that room packed with investors and sycophants. I'd known it since it was more refined, more nervous, more humble, since it belonged to a 23-year-old mechanic who showed up at my door in North Miami with greasy hands asking for piano lessons because he'd seen my ad on the laundromat board. He walked past me without looking. Of course he didn't. Janitors are furniture. We're part of the scenery, like vases of white orchids or linen curtains. But I looked. I looked at his perfectly tailored suit jacket, at the watch that probably cost more than my entire year's rent, at the way he gestured with his hands as if he commanded the universe. That's when he stopped. He turned to the nearest table, picked up a half-empty glass of red wine, and looked directly at me. Our eyes met in the marble reflection. He smiled. It wasn't a gentle smile. Then he tipped the glass. Slowly. Deliberately. The wine dripped like blood onto the floor I'd just cleaned, forming a red puddle that spread toward my knees. The crystal shattered as it hit the marble. The noise cut through all conversation. Utter silence fell over the room like a heavy cloth. Adrian bent down to my level. I could smell the whiskey on his breath, mixed with that expensive cologne all billionaires wear. He placed his hand on my shoulder, heavy, possessive, and whispered softly enough for only me to hear. He told me that if I wanted to keep my job, if I wanted to keep paying the rent for that crummy apartment I lived in, I had to get down on my knees and clean up that mess with my tongue. He said it with a smile. He said it knowing I had no choice. He said it because he could. Something inside me broke at that moment. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was silent and definitive, like a piano string snapping. I felt it happen physically. A rupture in the center of my chest that left me completely empty for exactly 3 seconds. So I stood up. I grabbed the bucket of water and disinfectant that was beside me. And I poured it all, every drop, every milliliter of ice-cold water and corrosive chemicals over Adrian Cole's head. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of 50 people holding their breath at once. I could hear the drops falling from his jacket onto the floor. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. I could hear the entire future rearranging itself in that instant. Because what Adrian didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that I had already found my daughter. I already knew what he had done. And I had already begun to assemble the complete score of my revenge. Let me back up a bit. Let me tell you how I got to that moment, bucket in hand, water running down a billionaire's face. Because none of this started that Friday in March. It started 3 years earlier, when I was still a nobody. I taught piano lessons in North Miami. I had a small studio on the second floor of a commercial building between a laundromat and an accounting office. I had 12 regular students, mostly children whose parents had that classic dream of turning their offspring into musical prodigies. I charged $45 an hour. It wasn't a fortune, but it paid the bills, and still had some left over for my 13-year-old daughter Isabella's ballet lessons. Isabella, my little girl, dark hair like mine, but with the light eyes of the father she never knew. She wanted to be a ballerina. Not in that casual way that children want to be astronauts or veterinarians. She really wanted it, with that intensity that hurts to see because you know how much the world will try to crush that kind of dream. Adrian showed up on a Tuesday morning. I remember because Tuesday was my slowest day. I only had 2 students that afternoon. He knocked on the studio door, holding a crumpled piece of paper with my ad. 23 years old, skinny as hell, with big, calloused hands from working with tools. He wore an oil-stained t-shirt and faded jeans. He smelled of car polish and cheap cigarettes. He told me he worked at a mechanic shop on Opelika, that he made $12 an hour, that he lived in a rented room with 3 other guys, but that he'd seen my ad and thought that maybe, just maybe, learning piano could make him a different person. He said it in that voice he hadn't yet learned to modulate, that accent of someone who grew up bouncing between Hialeah and Little Havana. I should have charged him. I should have told him my lessons cost $45 and that I wasn't doing charity work. But there was something in the way he looked at the used Yamaha piano I'd bought on 18 installments. It was hunger. I recognized it because I'd felt the same way before. So I told him I could teach for free on Tuesday mornings before my paying students arrived. 1 hour a week. He almost cried. He promised he'd pay me back someday. He promised he'd be somebody. He promised and promised and promised. For 6 months, he showed up religiously every Tuesday at 8 in the morning. He had 0 talent for piano. His fingers were stiff, his rhythm erratic, and he couldn't read music even after I'd explained it to him 15 times. But he made up for it with obsessive dedication. He'd arrive half an hour early. He'd stay half an hour later. He'd ask questions about everything, not about music, about business. He asked how I set up my studio, how I got students, how I priced my classes, how much I earned per month, if I paid taxes, if I was formally registered or worked on the side. I thought it was strange at the time, but I answered, because he seemed genuinely curious, because he seemed to want to learn to be more than a mechanic. After class, he'd sit drinking instant coffee I'd made in a corner of the studio and talk about his plans. He wanted to open his own shop. He wanted to study business administration. I wanted to invest in technology because I'd read in an article that it was the future. I listened. I offered advice when I could. I was maternal to him the way I am to anyone who seems lost. It was in November that I changed his life. My student Amanda, a 10-year-old who played Chopin better than many adults, mentioned that her cousin had a tech startup and was looking for someone to help with logistics. Nothing fancy, just organizing deliveries and managing inventory. The pay was $22 an hour. I called Amanda's cousin. I spoke highly of Adrian. I said he was hardworking, dedicated, and punctual. I omitted the fact that he was taking free piano lessons with me because he couldn't afford them. I omitted the fact that his fingers were always covered in grease. I omitted my doubts. The cousin agreed to give him a chance. Adrian got the job. He showed up at the studio the following week with cheap supermarket flowers and tears in his eyes. He told me I'd changed his life. He told me he'd never forget what I'd done for him. He hugged me too tightly, for too long. I felt uncomfortable for the first time, but I ignored it because I was happy to have helped. He stopped coming to class after that. He texted me saying work was taking up all his time and that he'd come back when things calmed down. He didn't. I wasn't bothered. I was satisfied knowing I'd made a difference in someone's life. 6 months later, I received a call from a mother canceling her daughter's classes. Then another. Then 2 more. In 3 weeks, I lost half my students. No one gave clear explanations. They said they were too busy, that they were going away, that the child had lost interest. But I heard something in their voices. Discomfort. Embarrassment. It was Amanda who finally told me. She was 12 years old and possessed that brutal honesty that children that age possess before they learn to lie out of politeness. She told me that her mother had told other mothers that I taught without receipts, that I probably didn't declare my income, that it was illegal, and that they didn't want to get involved with someone working in the shadows. My stomach dropped. I asked how her mother knew about this. Amanda shrugged and said her cousin had mentioned it. Her cousin, the one who had given Adrian a job. I called him and asked him directly if he'd discussed my tax situation with anyone. He hesitated, then admitted that Adrian had casually mentioned during a conversation that I worked on the side that I had no formal registration. His cousin thought it was harmless information. He didn't imagine Adrian would use it strategically. I tried calling Adrian. His number was deactivated. I searched social media. He had blocked me. I went to the startup. The receptionist told me he had been promoted to operations manager and was now working in another office downtown. That's when I found the first document. I was filing my back taxes, the one from 2 years earlier, when Adrian was still attending my classes. I had saved all the receipts for business expenses in a folder. Among them was a certificate of completion of a business management course. On behalf of Adrian Cole, signed by me, as if I were the certified instructor. My vision blurred around the edges. I took the paper with trembling hands. The signature was perfect. He had forged my signature. He had created a fake certificate using my name as if I were some kind of accredited educational institution, and he had used it to get not only the job with Amanda's cousin, but probably other opportunities later. I called a lawyer. He told me that suing would be expensive and time-consuming, that I would need to prove direct material damages, and that Adrian could claim it was a misunderstanding. He then asked about my tax situation. I had to admit that I had been working without official registration for years. The lawyer was silent for 3 long seconds. Then he told me that Adrian could easily turn everything against me. He could claim I'd suggested the fake certificate. He could expose my irregular status. He could destroy me. Then he told me, in that tired voice of someone who's seen this story 1,000 times, that the best thing to do was forget it. Move on. Don't bother. I hung up the phone and cried for the first time in 5 years. I cried because I had helped someone, and that someone had used me. I cried because I couldn't do anything. I cried because the world rewarded men like Adrian and punished women like me. In the following months, I lost almost all my students. Reputation is everything when you work with families. Once the rumor mill starts, there's no stopping it. I had to close the studio. I had to pull Isabella out of ballet classes. I had to take cleaning jobs because it was the only place I'd hire without asking too many questions. And Adrian? Adrian started appearing in the local news. Young entrepreneur, brilliant tech mind, Silicon Valley genius who started out fixing cars. In every interview, he talked about hard work and meritocracy. He never mentioned my name, never mentioned the free classes or the connections I had made for him. I learned to survive in silence. I learned to be invisible. I learned that sometimes the only way to maintain dignity is to swallow your anger and move on. Until 3 months ago, Isabella landed an internship at Coltech, Adrian's company. My brilliant, determined 16-year-old daughter, working for the man who had destroyed my life. And then she disappeared. Isabella didn't come home on a Thursday. She had a message saying she was staying late at the office finishing a project. Normal. She was dedicated like that, just like me at her age. I texted her at 8 o'clock asking if she wanted me to pick her up. No answer. I called at 10. Voicemail. At midnight, I started calling all the numbers she'd given me for colleagues from her internship. No one answered. Or worse, they answered and said they didn't know where she was, that she'd left the office at 6 as usual. A boy named Marcus hesitated before hanging up. I heard it in his voice. That pause of someone who knows something but is afraid to say it. At 2 in the morning, I was at the police station. The officer looked at me with that weary expression I knew so well. He told me 16-year-old girls disappear all the time, that she probably had a boyfriend, that I should wait 48 hours. I begged. He yawned and took my number, saying he'd look into the matter. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, cell phone in hand, mentally retracing every conversation I'd had with Isabella in the past few weeks, looking for clues, looking for signs I'd ignored. She had mentioned something strange 2 weeks earlier. She was doing data analysis for the finance department, a basic intern job, organizing spreadsheets and checking numbers. She had found discrepancies, amounts that didn't add up, transfers that didn't make sense. She had brought it to her supervisor, a man named Paul Monroe. Paul had said it was a system error. He'd told her not to worry. He'd said, and Isabella had repeated the exact words to me with that imitative tone teenagers use, that interns shouldn't ask questions above their level. I'd laughed at the time. I'd said every office had these small men with fragile egos. I'd told her to do her job and stay out of company politics. I'd given her the most cowardly advice possible because I was scared. Scared she'd upset someone. Scared she'd lose her internship. Scared Adrian would find out who her mother was and do to Isabella what he'd done to me. Because I'd never told her. I'd never told her I knew Adrian Cole. I'd never explained why we'd lost everything 3 years earlier. I'd made excuses about the economic crisis and student shortages. I'd shielded her from the truth. I'd shielded my wounded pride. And now, she was gone. On Friday morning, I returned to Coltech. The building was glass and steel, one of those modern Brickell buildings that reflect the sky and make you feel small. The receptionist told me she couldn't give out employee information. I asked to speak to human resources. She said I needed to schedule an appointment. I started yelling. Security guards showed up. 2 large men with the posture of someone who's removed hysterical mothers before. They asked me to leave. They told me they were going to call the police. I told them too. I told them my daughter was missing. I told them she worked there and that someone knew something. That's when I saw her. Natalie Cole, Adrian's wife. She was walking across the lobby with a leather briefcase and high heels. She stopped when she heard me shout my daughter's name. Our eyes met. I saw something in her face. Recognition. Not of me, but of the situation. She approached. She waved the security guards away. She asked my name. When I said Elena Reyes, I saw a subtle change in her expression. She knew my name. Somehow, she knew my name. Natalie led me to an empty conference room on the 3rd floor. She closed the glass doors. She sat across from me. She studied me for a long time. Then she asked if I'd tried the hospitals. My blood ran cold. I asked her why she thought my daughter would be in a hospital. Natalie hesitated. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She did that mental calculation everyone does when deciding whether or not to cross a line of no return. Then she told me. Quietly. Controlled. She told me she'd heard rumors. That other interns had abruptly left the company. That they'd all signed strange confidentiality agreements. That the agreements came with financial compensation too small to be legal, but too large for 16, 17-year-old girls to refuse. I asked what she was implying. Natalie didn't answer directly. Instead, she told me she had notarial authority over Coltech's affairs, that Adrian traveled a lot and she routinely signed documents, that she technically had access to files she didn't normally look at because she trusted her husband. But lately, in the last 6 months, he had begun to suspect. I looked at her. I really looked. I saw a woman in her 40s, beautiful in that expensive way money buys, impeccable clothes, understated jewelry. But I also saw dark circles barely concealed with concealer. I saw the way she twisted her wedding ring on her finger. I saw defeat in her slightly slumped shoulders. I asked her why she was helping me. Natalie gave a bitter, humorless laugh. She said maybe she was tired of being an accomplice. Maybe she hadn't been able to sleep properly in months. Maybe having a daughter the same age as the interns made a difference. Or maybe, she said, looking me in the eyes, maybe she was just waiting for the right excuse to finally look in the places she had avoided looking. She picked up the phone, made 3 calls: Jackson Memorial Hospital, Mount Sinai Hospital, Mercy Hospital. She asked about any female patients admitted in the last 48 hours, 16, possibly unidentified. On the 3rd call, his face changed. He wrote something down on a piece of paper. He hung up. He handed me the paper with a firm hand. Isabella had been admitted to Mount Sinai on Thursday night. Unconscious, mild head trauma, no identification, no one responsible. The hospital bill had been paid anonymously in cash early Friday morning. I ran away. I didn't even thank Natalie. I didn't even think. I just ran. I found my daughter in a hospital bed, awake, alive, with a bandage on her head and the frightened eyes of a cornered animal. When she saw me, she began to cry. That cry of a child who's tried too hard for too long. I threw myself on the bed and hugged her. I felt her thin body trembling against mine. I smelled her hair, which smelled like a hospital. I felt the terror I'd held in for 36 hours finally leaving me in waves. I didn't ask anything there. I just held her. Later, at home, with hot tea and a blanket, she told me. She told me slowly, with long pauses, her voice breaking. She had continued investigating the discrepancies, alone, late into the night. She had downloaded files to a flash drive. She had discovered they weren't system errors. They were systematic misappropriations, small amounts being transferred from employees' retirement funds to personal accounts. $50 here, $100 there. Over the course of 2 years, they added up to nearly $200,000. She had documented everything. She had shown it to Paul Monroe. Paul had turned pale. He had asked for her flash drive. He had promised to fix it. He had sent her home. On Thursday night, 2 men followed her as she left the office. She sped up. They sped up. She ran. They chased her. In the parking lot, one of them pushed her. She hit her head on the concrete. She passed out. She woke up in front of the hospital. Someone had called 911 and disappeared. None of the men were there. Her flash drive was gone. Her backpack was empty. But in her bank account, when she finally checked, there was a deposit of $5,000 and a message from an unknown number telling her to forget what she'd seen, telling her that accidents happen, telling her not to come back. I held her hand as she spoke. I felt nails digging into my palm. I felt absolute clarity descending upon me like ice. Adrian had done this. Maybe not personally, but he had allowed it. He had created an environment where it could happen. He had built an empire on silenced and threatened women, and I had kept quiet 3 years ago. I had swallowed my anger. I had accepted my defeat. I had become invisible, but he had touched my daughter, and that changed absolutely everything. I looked at Isabella. I held her face in my hands. I told her I would fix this. I told her no one would ever hurt her again. I told her I would make Adrian pay for every tear she had shed. She looked at me with those eyes still swollen from crying and asked how. What could I do? I was a janitor. He was a billionaire. I smiled. For the first time in 3 years, I smiled with something other than resignation. I told her to trust me. I told her I had something he never would. I had perfect pitch. And I remembered everything. I spent the entire weekend rebuilding. I didn't sleep more than 3 hours a night. Isabella stayed home, recovering, watching movies she wasn't paying attention to, while I turned our dining room table into a makeshift operations center. I dug out all the old notebooks I'd kept from my studio days. Notebooks where I'd jotted down lesson schedules, payments, observations about students. But also, flipping through yellowed pages, I discovered notes about Adrian. Dates of our conversations, things he'd told me, names he'd mentioned. Because that's how my brain works. Musicians with perfect pitch don't just hear notes. They hear patterns. They memorize sequences. They catalog information in an almost pathological way. He remembered the time Adrian mentioned his cousin Paul Monroe, the same Paul who now worked at Coltech. Adrian had said Paul was a genius with numbers but had a gambling problem, that he owed money to the wrong people, that Adrian would help him when he had money. He remembered another name, Rick Alvarez, a colleague from the auto shop. Adrian said Rick would do anything for money, anything at all. He'd laughed when he'd said it, that nervous laugh of someone half impressed, half scared. I started searching for these names on social media. Paul Monroe was Coltech's vice president of finance. Rick Alvarez was head of security. Adrian had brought them all in. He had built his empire not on competence, but on the loyalty of people who owed him favors or held secrets. On Monday, I went back to work. I had no choice. I needed the money. But I also needed to be close, because Cipriani in Brickell wasn't just an expensive restaurant. It was where Coltech executives held meetings. It was where Adrian signed contracts. It was where I could listen. My supervisor looked at me strangely when I arrived. She asked if I was okay. My eyes must have been red from exhaustion. She said I was fine. I grabbed my bucket and got to work. Janitors are invisible. That's our advantage. No one stops talking when we enter a room. No one lowers their voice. We're mobile. We're part of the scenery. And I'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of disappearing. But now he was listening. Really listening. With every trained skill he possessed. Memorizing conversations, cataloging names, creating a mental score of who was talking to whom, who had power, who was afraid. It was on a Tuesday that I overheard something useful. I was cleaning the women's restroom when 2 women came in. They hadn't seen me behind the door of the last stall. They started talking. One of them was crying. The other was comforting. The one crying said she couldn't take it anymore, that she had signed that agreement, that she had taken the $15,000, that she had promised never to speak. But every night she dreamed of that office, with the locked door, with his hand on her arm. The other said she understood, that she had signed it too, that they had all signed it, that there was no way around it, that suing would expose everything, that his lawyers would destroy them, that it was better to take the money and try to forget. I stood frozen inside the booth, breathing through my nose to keep quiet. I waited for them to leave. When they did, I rushed to write down everything I'd heard, every word, every pause, every detail. Isabella was right. It wasn't just embezzlement. It was standard practice. It was a system. Adrian had built an empire by silencing women who asked questions or who he simply decided to use. I needed more. I needed names. I needed dates. I needed proof that wasn't just my word against his. That's when I remembered Natalie. She had helped me find Isabella. She had mentioned notarial power. She had access. I called her that night. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was careful, controlled. She asked how my daughter was. She said Isabella was home recovering. I thanked her for helping me. There was silence. Then Natalie asked what I really wanted. Straight up. No beating around the bush. I told the truth. I said I wanted to destroy her husband. I said he had ruined my life 3 years ago. I said he had almost killed my daughter. I said he had probably done this to dozens of other women, and that I would stop him, with or without her help. More silence. So long I thought she'd hung up. Then she laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone who'd hit rock bottom and finally found something solid to hold on to. She told me to meet her, not at Coltech, not in a public place, at her house. Adrian was traveling to San Francisco. He wouldn't be back until Friday. I arrived at their house on a Wednesday night, a mansion in Coconut Grove. Automatic gate, a garden that probably cost more to maintain than my annual rent. A lit pool reflecting off the huge windows. Natalie opened the door wearing sweatpants and her hair tied back. No makeup. She looked 10 years older and simultaneously more regal. She led me to the second-floor office. Adrian's office. Dark wood, books no one probably read, a state-of-the-art computer. Natalie sat in his chair. She turned on the computer. She knew the password. She told me she'd discovered the password 6 months ago, that she'd become suspicious when she found a jewelry box hidden in his closet. Jewelry I'd never seen before. Jewelry that wasn't for her. That cost too little to be gifts from a billionaire husband to his lover. That looked like gifts from a boss to an intern. I'd started searching, discreetly. Financial documents, emails, files. I'd found the confidentiality agreements, 7 of them, all with young women, all with the same lawyer, all with the same structure, small payment, absolute silence, veiled threats about the consequences of breaking the agreement. Natalie showed me the files. I sat down. I read each one. I felt nausea rising in my stomach. They were forms, standardized contracts, as if silencing women were a routine administrative procedure. I asked her why she was showing me this, because she hadn't done anything 6 months ago when she found out. Natalie looked at me with tired eyes. She said she was afraid, that Adrian controlled everything, that she had signed a prenup that would leave her practically with nothing if she filed for divorce, that he had built a narrative over the years that she was unstable, emotionally fragile, that no one would believe her, that she would be destroyed. But seeing a desperate mother searching for her missing daughter had changed something, that I couldn't pretend anymore, that I was willing to take a risk. Then she offered me something. She told me there would be an event at Coltech on Friday, a new product launch, investors, press, Adrian putting on his usual show, and that she, as his wife, would have access to everything, including physical files that were locked in his office. He told me we could go in together, that we could get everything, that we could expose him. But I needed to have a plan. You needed to know exactly what to do with the information, because we only had one chance. If we messed up, he would destroy us both. I looked at the woman I hadn't met until a week ago, wife of the man I hated, but also someone trapped in the same web as me, someone tired of being silenced. He said he had a plan. He didn't. But he was going to create one. I returned home that night and didn't sleep again. I sat in the living room with my notebook open. I began doing what I always did when something was too complex to understand linearly. I began treating it like sheet music. Each person was an instrument. Each action was a note. Each timing was a pause. Everything had to be orchestrated perfectly. One mistake, and the entire symphony would fall apart. Isabella came down at 3 in the morning. She saw me surrounded by papers. She sat down next to me. She didn't say anything. She just picked up one of the notebooks and began to read. Then she picked up another, and another. Finally, she spoke. She said she could help, that she understood spreadsheets, that she could organize data so even a child could understand, that she could transform confusing files into clear evidence. I looked at my daughter, 16 years old, the scar still visible on her forehead, her eyes determined. And I realized she was no longer a child I needed to protect. She was an ally. She was a weapon. I said yes. I said I needed her help. I said that together we would be stronger. We spent the rest of the night working. She was on the computer. I was in my notebooks, putting together a score, identifying each player, every necessary move, every weak point. Adrian thought he had built an impenetrable empire, but he had made a classic mistake. He had underestimated the women he had silenced. He had thought that trauma would be enough to keep them all quiet forever. I hadn't seen revenge orchestrated by a woman with perfect pitch and a daughter with spreadsheets. I wasn't prepared for us. On Thursday, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I started playing the piano again. Not my own piano. I'd sold that. But I had a cheap digital keyboard I bought used for Isabella when she wanted to learn. It sat in the corner of the room, covered in dust. I sat down and played. Bach, Invention Number 1 in C major. 15 seconds later, my fingers remembered. Muscles memorize. Even after years of scrubbing marble, even with broken nails and cuticles bleeding from chemicals. My fingers remembered. Isabella stopped working on the computer and looked at me. She hadn't seen me play since she was 10, since before everything fell apart. She didn't say anything, she just listened. And when I finished, she had tears in her eyes. He said he'd forgotten how beautiful he was. He said he'd forgotten how good I was. He said he understood now why I'd fought so hard to keep the studio going. I explained that I was playing for practical reasons. My brain works best when my fingers are busy. Musical patterns help me see patterns in other things, how to connect people, how to predict movements, how to orchestrate revenge. She understood. We got back to work. Natalie called Friday morning. Her voice was tense. Adrian had returned from San Francisco early. He would be at the event that evening. The plan remained the same, but the timing would be tighter. Less room for error? I asked if she was sure she wanted to move forward. It was the last moment to give up. Natalie laughed, that bitter laugh I already recognized. She said she'd passed the point of no return 6 months ago, that she was just waiting for the right push. She said we'd meet at the event at 8. She could get me in. I was to arrive dressed simply. Nothing that would draw attention. I was to act like a staff member, invisible as I always was. I spent the day mentally reviewing every step, every contingency, every possible error. Isabella did the same with the spreadsheets. She organized the data so clearly that even a lawyer could understand it. Dates, values, names, everything connected. The time had come. I dressed in black pants and a white blouse, the universal uniform of those who serve. I tied up my hair. No makeup. I wanted to be forgettable. Isabella hugged me before leaving, tightly. She asked me to be careful. I promised I would be. I lied. I wouldn't be careful. I would be brave. The event was held in the Coltech building itself. Cocktails on the 20th floor. Panoramic views of the city. Waiters circulating with champagne. Executives laughing too loudly. Classic. Natalie met me in the parking lot. He gave me an access badge. He said Adrian's office was on the 18th floor. Security would be distracted by the event. We had 20 minutes at most. We went up together. I used the service stairs. She took the guest elevator. We met on the 18th floor. The hallway was empty. The emergency light cast strange shadows. Natalie opened the office door with a key she'd copied months ago. We went in. We closed it behind us. We turned on only a desk lamp. It was dim, but enough. The office was a study in male ego. Awards lined the walls. Photos of him with politicians and celebrities. A massive wooden desk. Everything was designed to intimidate. Natalie went straight to the file cabinet. She knew the exact location. She pulled out a thick folder and handed it to me. Inside was everything. Copies of confidentiality agreements, bank transfers, emails, documents that proved a systematic pattern. I started photographing everything with my cell phone, page by page, methodically. Isabella had taught me how to do it. Proper light, the right angle, perfect sharpness. That's when we heard voices in the hallway. Natalie froze. I looked at her. She shook her head. There shouldn't have been anyone on that floor. Everyone should have been at the event. The voice grew closer. I recognized it. It was Paul Monroe, and he was bringing someone. Natalie and I exchanged desperate looks. There was no hiding place. There was no way out. We were trapped. The door opened. Paul walked in. He stopped when he saw us. His expression went from surprise to anger to fear in 3 seconds. Behind him stood a man I didn't immediately recognize. Then I remembered. Rick Alvarez, head of security, the man who would do anything for money. Paul tried to speak. He tried to ask what we were doing. But Rick was quicker. He closed the door, locked it. He stood between us and the exit. He said nothing. He just waited. Paul finally formed a complete sentence. He asked if Natalie had lost her mind. If she knew what Adrian would do when he found out. If she understood she was destroying her own marriage. Natalie responded with the firmest voice I'd expected. He said the marriage was already destroyed, that he'd lived 6 months knowing what a husband was, that he couldn't stand being an accomplice any longer. Paul looked at me. He finally recognized me. He said my name, Elena Reyes. He asked what I was doing there. He said I was a janitor. He said it with contempt, as if my profession were offensive. I responded. I said I was collecting evidence. I said he and Adrian had almost killed my daughter. I said I was going to expose everything. Paul laughed. It wasn't genuine laughter. It was the nervous laugh of a cornered man trying to appear in control. He said I had nothing, that without context those documents proved nothing, that Adrian had lawyers who would destroy me. That's when I realized something. Paul was scared, really scared, not of me, of Adrian. He worked for Adrian, but he was always terrified of him. I changed my approach. I asked how much Adrian paid him to keep quiet, how much his conscience was worth, how much it cost to wake up every day knowing he was an accomplice to a man who abused interns and stole from employees. Paul went pale. Rick stepped forward, a threatening gesture, but I continued. I said I had documents. I said Isabella had compiled spreadsheets showing exactly how money was being diverted. I said I knew Paul was facilitating transfers. I said that when everything came to light, he would be arrested along with Adrian. Unless... Pause. I left the word hanging in the air. Unless he testified. Unless he decided to be a witness instead of an accomplice. Paul looked at Rick. Rick looked at Paul. I saw calculation happening between them. I saw loyalty being tested against self-preservation. Then something unexpected happened. Rick spoke. He said he was tired. He said Adrian owed him 2 months' salary. He said he'd done things he couldn't forget. He said my daughter's name, Isabella. He said he was the one who pushed her, that he didn't want to, that Adrian had ordered it, that someone needed to scare her. My blood boiled. I wanted to jump on him. I wanted to claw his eyes out, but Natalie held my arm, firmly, and whispered that we needed him, that his confession was worth more than physical revenge. I breathed. I controlled myself. I asked if he was willing to testify. Rick hesitated. He looked at Paul. Paul was shaking. Finally, Paul spoke. He said yes, that he would testify, that he couldn't take it anymore, that he had a gambling problem, that Adrian had paid off his debts, that he'd been in prison ever since, that he did what Adrian told him because he had no choice. But now he saw a way out, and he was going to take it. Natalie looked at me. I saw a question in her eyes. Could we trust them? Was this a trap? I grabbed my phone. I set it to record. I told them to repeat everything. Everything they had just said, in detail. Dates, amounts, names. They talked. For 15 minutes they talked. They confessed everything. Financial embezzlement, illegal agreements, threats, and in Rick's case, assault, against my daughter. When they finished, I saved the recording. I sent a copy to Isabella, a copy to my email, a copy to the cloud. I wasn't going to risk losing it. Then I said we needed more. We needed Victoria Sanders, financial manager. She had signed transfers. She knew everything. Paul said Victoria was at the event, that she was a key player, that without her we wouldn't have proof of the financial part, that confidentiality agreements and recordings wouldn't be enough if we couldn't prove systematic theft. Natalie thought about it. Then she said she'd get Victoria, that she'd convince her to come upstairs. that we could tell Adrian wanted to talk to her, that Victoria wouldn't suspect anything. He left. The four of us sat in awkward silence. Paul sat down. Rick stood near the door. I remained standing, clutching a folder of documents, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. 10 minutes later, the door opened. Natalie, and behind her, a woman in her 50s, gray hair, glasses, a confused expression. Victoria Sanders. She walked in. She saw Paul. She saw Rick. She saw me and Natalie. Confusion turned to understanding and panic in seconds. She tried to leave. Rick blocked the door. Natalie spoke. Her voice was gentle. She said no one would hurt her. She said they just wanted to talk. She said Victoria had a choice. She could continue protecting Adrian, or she could finally do the right thing. Victoria trembled, literally trembled. She said she couldn't. She said she had a family. She said Adrian would destroy her. I showed Isabella a photo on my phone. A photo of her in the hospital, a bandage on her head. Her eyes were frightened. I said that was my daughter. I said Rick had done it on Adrian's orders. I said Victoria had facilitated anonymous hospital payments, that she knew, that she was an accomplice. Victoria began to cry. He said she had no choice, that Adrian had discovered she had embezzled $5,000 years ago to pay for her sick husband's treatment, that she had been in prison ever since, that she did what he told her because she couldn't go to prison, because she needed to take care of her husband. I understood in that moment. Adrian didn't build his empire through skill. He built it through blackmail. He found weaknesses in each person and exploited them. Paul was in debt. Rick needed money. Victoria had a secret. Everyone was trapped. Everyone was doing horrible things because they saw no way out. I told Victoria there was a way out. I said that if she testified, she would be a witness, not a criminal. I said that a prosecutor would be interested in a small-time embezzler compared to a systematic thief. I said she could save her husband rather than risk leaving him alone when she was arrested. Victoria looked at me, at Natalie, at Paul, who was nodding encouragingly, at Rick, who just shrugged. So she said yes. She said she would testify. She said she would hand over everything, every transfer, every document, every incriminating email she had kept safe. Natalie smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from her. He said we needed to leave, that the event was ending, that Adrian would be looking for her soon, that we needed to leave first. But I said no. I said we weren't running away. I said we were going to the event, all together, and that we were going to do it right. He said he had a better plan, much better, because Adrian wasn't going to be exposed in a quiet trial. He wasn't going to be arrested quietly. He was going to be publicly destroyed, in front of all the investors, in front of the entire press, in front of everyone he'd impressed with his fabricated story of being a self-made man. And it was going to start on Monday, at Cipriani, with a bucket of water. I spent the weekend turning our living room into headquarters. Natalie came on Saturday, Victoria on Sunday. Paul and Rick texted but didn't show up in person. They were still afraid. I didn't blame them. I was afraid too, but fear became fuel. Isabella created a visual timeline. Brown paper taped to the entire wall, every event marked, every connection drawn. It looked like a detective story in a crime movie, but it was real. It was our lives. It was evidence of 3 years of systematic destruction. Natalie brought more documents. I discovered she had copied practically Adrian's entire file over the months. Not just confidentiality agreements, fraudulent contracts, compromising emails, even recordings of calls he thought he'd deleted but which were archived on a company server. She said it had started as insurance, in case she needed to defend herself in a possible divorce. But now she saw it was for this very moment, as if she had been preparing herself without knowing it. Victoria arrived with a flash drive. She said she'd spent the entire Friday and Saturday extracting data, bank transfers, spreadsheets, receipts, everything that proved systematic embezzlement. She said the amounts reached $473,000 over 3 years, not the $200,000 Isabella had initially estimated. Much worse. We all sat around the table, 4 women, 4 different generations, Natalie in her 40s, me in my 38s, Victoria in my 50s, Isabella, 16, united by a man who had hurt them all in different ways. We devised a strategy. It couldn't just be handing over evidence to the police. Adrian had connections, he had lawyers, he had money. The legal process could drag on for years. It could be hushed up. It could result in an out-of-court settlement and silence. We needed irreversible public impact. We needed the story to spread so quickly and so widely that no lawyer could contain it. We needed to turn Adrian Cole into an example, a warning, a cautionary tale that other women could use. Natalie suggested the press. She had contacts. She knew investigative journalists. We could submit a complete dossier, let professionals tell the story. But I said it wasn't enough. Journalists could be intimidated. They could be sued. Stories could be buried in inside pages. We needed something more visceral, more personal, more impossible to ignore. It was Isabella who had the idea. She said Adrian had an important meeting on Monday, a meeting with Japanese investors, at Cipriani, a public place, dozens of witnesses. Perfect for a confrontation that couldn't be hidden. And I worked there. I would be invisible until the exact moment I chose to be seen. Victoria hesitated. She said a public confrontation could backfire, that Adrian could turn the tables on him, that everyone might think we were crazy, hysterical, bitter women making up stories. I looked at her. I understood her fear. But I said that was precisely why we had evidence. It wasn't just our words. It was documents, numbers, recordings, confessions from his own accomplices. And he went on to say more. He said Adrian had underestimated women his entire life. He thought we were weak, easily silenced, easily controlled. That would be his weapon. Because he never expected the caretaker he regularly humiliated to be the one who would destroy him. Natalie agreed. She said she would be there, that as his wife, she had reason to be there, that at the right time she could make an entrance, add weight, show that she wasn't just a disgruntled former employee, but his own wife turning against him. We put together a script, every step, every line, every document that would be shown and in what order. We treated it like a theatrical production, because in a sense it was. It was a performance that would change lives. But on Sunday night, something happened that almost destroyed everything. Isabella was sleeping. Victoria had left. Natalie was on the couch reviewing documents. I got a message. Unknown number. I know what you're planning. Stop now or you'll regret it. My blood ran cold. I showed it to Natalie. She turned pale. I said Adrian must have found out, that there were probably cameras in the office we didn't know about, that someone had told her, Paul or Rick. I started to panic. All the work, all the preparation, everything could fall apart. If Adrian knew, he would act in advance. He would hide evidence. He would make witnesses disappear. He would destroy us before we could destroy him. Natalie held my hand, firmly. She looked me in the eye. She told me we couldn't stop now, that if we did, we'd be admitting defeat, that Adrian would live the rest of his life knowing he could do anything because there would always be times when victims would cower. But what if we moved forward, even knowing he knew, even risking everything? We would show that we were no longer women who could be silenced with threats. He was right. He knew he was. But the fear was real, physical. He could feel it in his stomach. His hands were shaking. His heart was racing. I thought of Isabella sleeping in her room, of everything she'd lost, of the scar on her forehead, of the fear in her eyes when she told me what had happened. I thought of all the other girls, of all the other women, of how many more would be hurt if I stopped now. I took a deep breath. I told Natalie we would move forward. That Monday was still the day, that Adrian could know, but that he couldn't stop what was already in motion. She smiled. That sad smile of someone who recognizes courage born of desperation. She said we would win, that she was sure. I wasn't sure. But I had determination. And sometimes that's enough. Monday dawned. I got up at 5 as usual. I made coffee. Isabella woke up early too. She said she couldn't sleep. I hadn't slept well either. I just dozed off between waves of anxiety. She hugged me before I left. Tight. Long. She said she was proud. She said I was stronger than I thought. She told me to come back in one piece. I promised I'd come back. I didn't know if it was true, but I promised. I arrived at Cipriani's at 7, 2 hours before Adrian arrived. 2 hours to mentally prepare. I put on my gray uniform. I tied up my hair. I grabbed a bucket and cleaning supplies. My supervisor greeted me. She asked if I was okay. I must have looked pale. I said I was fine. She didn't seem convinced, but she didn't insist. I got to work. The main hall, the one with the mirrors, the one where everything would happen. I cleaned every table, every chair, every inch of marble. I made everything perfect, almost ritualistic, preparing the stage for the final performance. Executives began arriving at 8:30. Men in suits, women in heels, all important, all powerful, all witnesses to what was about to happen. I saw Adrian walk in at 9. Perfect suit, confident smile, gesturing to Japanese investors. Charming, being the charming billionaire everyone admired. He didn't see me. Of course he didn't. I was mobile. But I saw him. I saw every move. I heard every word. I cataloged every arrogant gesture. And I waited. Natalie arrived at 9:15, elegantly dressed, impeccable posture. No one would suspect she was about to cheat on her husband. Our eyes met for a split second. She nodded almost imperceptibly. She was ready. I saw Paul in the corner of the room, nervous, sweating despite the air conditioning. Rick was near the entrance, his posture tense. They both knew what was coming. They were both terrified. Victoria arrived last. As finance manager, she had reason to be present, but I saw her hands trembling as she reached for her water glass. I saw the way she avoided looking at Adrian. We were all there, all the players, all the instruments, waiting for the conductor to give the signal, and I was the regent. It was 9:27. Adrian stood in the center of the room, laughing, telling some probably fabricated story. Investors smiled politely. I grabbed my bucket, water and disinfectant. I walked toward his desk, slowly, purposefully, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Adrian saw me. Finally, he saw me. He looked at me with that casual contempt, that certainty of superiority. Then he smiled. That smile I hated, the one that promised humiliation. He picked up a glass of red wine. He tipped it over onto the marble, just as he had done on Friday. Crystal shattered. Wine spilled. And he said those words, the same words, about me kneeling, about cleaning with my tongue, about keeping my job. Everyone heard it this time. Because he said it loud, because he wanted an audience, because public humiliation was more satisfying to him. Silence fell over the room. 50 people held their breath, waiting to see what the pathetic janitor would do. I looked at Adrian, straight in the eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, he truly saw me. He didn't see the uniform. He didn't see the janitor. He saw Elena Reyes. He saw the woman he had destroyed. And he saw something in my eyes that made him hesitate for a split second. I grabbed the bucket. I stood up and poured every drop of ice-cold water over his head. What came next changed everything. Forever. The silence after the water was absolute. I could hear drops falling from Adrian's jacket onto the marble. Each one marked the seconds. Tick, 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 countdown to explosion. Adrian stood frozen. Water dripped down his face, hair plastered to his forehead. His $3,000 jacket was soaked and ruined. His expression went through 5 stages in 3 seconds. shock, disbelief, anger, fear, and finally, that false arrogance of a powerful man trying to regain control. He began speaking, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. He said I was fired. He said he was going to sue me. He said he was going to destroy me. He said all this while trying to dry his face with a napkin someone offered. I let him speak. I waited, because timing was everything. In music, you learn that pauses are as important as notes. Silence between phrases creates tension, and I was creating a symphony. When he finished his initial threats, I looked around the room. 50 faces were watching me, some shocked, some amused, some clearly uncomfortable. Japanese investors looked confused. They didn't understand what was happening, but they knew it was something important. Then I spoke. My voice was calm, clear, louder than usual, but without shouting. I said my name, Elena Reyes. I said that 3 years ago I was a piano teacher. I said I had given Adrian free lessons when he was a bankrupt mechanic. I saw his expression change. I saw the exact moment he recognized me. He really did. Not as a caretaker. As a ghost from the past he thought he'd buried. I continued. I said I'd helped him get his first decent job. I said he'd forged a certificate using my name. I said that when he found out, he'd destroyed my reputation and my career. I said all this looking directly at him but speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. Adrian tried to interrupt. He tried to tell me I was crazy, that I was making up stories, that I was a disgruntled employee with delusions. But his voice came out shrill, desperate, and everyone noticed. That's when Natalie stood up, from the back of the room, walking slowly toward the center, high heels echoing on the marble. Everyone looked at her. His wife, elegant, composed, walking to stand beside me. She looked at Adrian. No emotion, no anger, just the profound weariness of someone who has carried a heavy secret for too long. And she said one word, enough. Adrian went white, literally white, because a wife turning on her husband in public was unthinkable betrayal. It was the end of a carefully constructed facade. It was the beginning of a crumbling. Natalie turned to the audience. She said she had documents. She said that over the past 3 years, Adrian had forced 7 young women to sign non-disclosure agreements. She mentioned the sums. 15,000, 12,000, 20,000. Payments to silence victims of harassment and abuse. Murmurs began. Low. Growing. Like a rising tide. Adrian tried to speak. He said Natalie was having a nervous breakdown, that she was unstable, that he'd argued with her that morning and she was vindictive. But Natalie just smiled, sad, tired, and picked up the phone. She projected an image onto the large screen being used for the corporate presentation. First document, non-disclosure agreement. The girl's name was redacted, but the date was clear. The payment amount was visible. Adrian's signature at the bottom. Then, second image, another agreement, another girl, another signature, and more, 7 documents, 7 victims, an indisputable pattern. The room exploded with conversation. Japanese investors stood up, speaking rapidly among themselves. Coldtech executives looked at each other in panic. Some were already picking up phones, probably calling lawyers, press officers, anyone who could control the damage. Adrian screamed. He said the documents were fabricated. He said Natalie had edited files. He said it was a conspiracy. His voice was hoarse, desperate, and everyone could hear the guilt in it. That's when Victoria stood up, from the opposite side of the room, walking to the center, stopping next to Natalie and me. 3 women now, 3 generations, 3 witnesses. Victoria gave her name, her position, Coldtech's financial manager. She said she had documented systematic embezzlement. She gave the exact amounts. $473,000. Withdrawn from the Employee Retirement Fund over 3 years, transferred to Adrian's personal accounts through sham transactions. She designed spreadsheets. Isabella had done a perfect job. Every line was colored differently. Every pattern was obvious even to the layman. Green for money flowing out of the fund, red for money flowing into personal accounts. Dates matched perfectly. Adrian was shaking now, not with anger, with fear, pure fear. Because it was no longer word against word. It was evidence. It was mathematics. It was impossible to deny. He tried one last time. He yelled at Victoria. He told her she was an accomplice, that she had facilitated transfers, that if he fell, she would fall with him. He tried to use her fear against her. But Victoria had already crossed the line. She had already made up her mind. She calmly said yes, that she was an accomplice, that Adrian had blackmailed her, that he had discovered a small mistake she made years ago and used it to force her to participate. But now she was testifying, that she had made a deal with the prosecutor, that her immunity depended on her full cooperation. I saw Adrian breaking, physically breaking, shoulders slumping, face crumbling, the mask of a confident billionaire dissolving to reveal the small, frightened man beneath. But it wasn't over. There was still one final piece missing, the most devastating one. Paul Monroe stood up, from the corner where he'd been hiding, walking like a man going to the guillotine, stopping in the circle we now formed. 4 people surrounding Adrian, closing off all exits. Paul confirmed everything Victoria said. He added details, account names, transfer dates. He admitted his role. He admitted Adrian paid off his gambling debts, that he'd been a puppet ever since, that he did what he was told because he saw no choice. But now he saw, and he chose conscience over complicity. Rick appeared, didn't speak, just stood there. His presence was a silent confirmation. Muscle, executioner, the man who pushed Isabella, who followed orders without question, now turning against the one who gave them orders. Adrian looked around, at all of us, at the room full of witnesses, at Japanese investors already leaving, at executives from his own company avoiding his eyes, at the empire crumbling in real time. He tried to leave. He took a step toward the door. Rick blocked his path. Not aggressively, he just stood there. A human barrier. That's when I heard sirens. Distant. Getting closer. Natalie had called the police before arriving. She had warned them about confessions to come, about evidence to be presented, about crimes to be publicly admitted. Adrian heard sirens, too. He looked at the door, at the windows, at any possible escape route. There was none. He was surrounded, physically and metaphorically. By women he had underestimated. By men he had controlled through fear. By his own arrogance, which made him think he could humiliate the janitor in public without consequences. Police officers entered, 3 of them. They spoke briefly with Natalie. She showed them her documents. They looked at Adrian. One of them approached. He gave his full name, Adrian Cole. He said he was being held for questioning, about fraud, about embezzlement, about multiple harassment allegations. Adrian didn't resist. There was no resistance left. He just stood there as handcuffs were placed. Metallic, cold, tight enough to dent skin. Before they took him away, our eyes met one last time. I saw everything I needed to see. Defeat, humiliation, fear. Everything he'd made me feel for 3 years reflected back at me. I said one last thing, quietly, just for him to hear. I told him he'd been right that Friday when he'd said I needed to kneel, but not in the way he thought. I had kneeled. I had scrubbed floors. I had been invisible. I had been overlooked and ignored. But while I was on my knees, I was listening, learning, planning, building revenge note by note until the full score was ready. And now he would hear music I composed, for the rest of his life. In every newspaper article, in every lawsuit, in every look of pity or disgust he would receive. They took him through the hall, 50 people watching, some filming with cell phones. An image that would be everywhere within hours. A billionaire being arrested, an empire falling, karma finally arriving. When the door closed behind him, silence fell again. Different this time. It wasn't tension. It was collective exhaustion. Liberation. The end of something that weighed heavily on everyone there, even those who didn't know it. Natalie hugged me, tightly. Victoria joined in. Then Paul, even Rick. A strange group united by a man who had hurt them all, now free, finally. And me. Elena Reyes, caretaker, pianist, mother, woman who had been invisible for too long, finally visible, finally heard, finally victorious. The reporters arrived 20 minutes later. Someone in the room had called, probably several someones. A story like this was too big to contain. A tech billionaire arrested for fraud and harassment, his wife turning against him, a caretaker orchestrating it all. It was the kind of headline everyone dreams of. Natalie suggested we leave, that we don't talk to the press yet, that we let the lawyers handle it. But I said no. He said we needed to talk, now, while everything was fresh, while emotions were raw. Because if we waited, Adrian's lawyers would find a way to distort the narrative. Victoria agreed with me. She said it needed to be now. It needed to be us, our voices, our words, unfiltered, unedited, pure, raw truth. We left Cipriani together. The sidewalk was crowded, cameras, microphones. Reporters shouting questions all at once, absolute chaos, but organized. They knew they had a big story, they wanted every detail. I stood in front, Natalie on my right, Victoria on my left, Paul and Rick behind. Deliberate formation, showing unity, showing that this wasn't just one disgruntled woman. This was a group. This was a pattern. This was a system being exposed. A CNN reporter pushed a microphone toward me. He asked my name. I asked everyone to stop shouting. I said I was going to make a statement. They would answer questions later. I needed order, control, timing. When relative silence fell, I began. I gave my full name. Elena Reyes, 38 years old, single mother, caretaker at Cipriani. And 3 years ago, a piano teacher who had made the mistake of helping an ambitious young man named Adrian Cole. I told the whole story, from free classes to certificate forgery, from the destruction of my reputation to the loss of my studio, from being forced to accept a cleaning job to the moment 3 months ago when my daughter Isabella landed an internship at Coltech. I stopped. I breathed. The next part was harder, more personal, more painful, but necessary. I told her about Isabella's disappearance, about finding her in the hospital, about discovering that men working for Adrian had pushed her. They had tried to silence her because she had uncovered financial embezzlement, about the $5,000 deposited as a bribe, about threatening messages telling her to forget what she had seen. My voice broke. I didn't try to hide it. I let my emotions show. Because it was real. Because it hurt. Because every mother watching would understand that pain of almost losing a daughter. Then I introduced Natalie, Adrian's wife. A woman who lived 6 months knowing the truth but trapped by fear and financial control. A woman who finally found courage when she saw a desperate mother searching for her missing daughter. Natalie spoke, her voice steady despite her tears. She talked about discovering confidentiality agreements, about 7 young women, about the pattern of harassment her husband had established, about hidden gems, about lies, about years of manipulation. He said he'd filed for divorce that morning, before we even got to Cipriani's, that he wanted nothing from him, no money, no property, just freedom, and that all his fortune should go to the employees he'd stolen from and the women he'd silenced. Cameras clicked frantically. Reporters wrote down every word. Some were clearly moved. A story like this wasn't just news, it was narrative, it was archetype. David versus Goliath, women versus patriarchy, justice versus power. Victoria spoke later. She admitted complicity. He didn't try to paint himself as innocent. He said he had facilitated embezzlement, that he had signed fraudulent transfers, that Adrian had blackmailed her, but that wasn't an excuse, that he had chosen fear over conscience. But now he was choosing differently, that he was cooperating fully with authorities, that he had handed over every document, every email, every piece of evidence he had collected over the years. Paul confirmed everything. He added that Adrian didn't build his empire alone, that he had help from people like him. Desperate people, people with weaknesses, people he systematically exploited. He said he owed money to the casino, that Adrian paid him back, and since then he was his property. But prison would be better than continuing to be a puppet. Rick spoke last. Few words, his voice thick with emotion, something he hadn't expected from a man who seemed so cold. He said he'd pushed the 16-year-old girl because his boss told him to, that he hadn't questioned her, that he'd just followed orders, that he now saw it wasn't an excuse, that Isabella could have died, that it haunted him, that he deserved prison, but that at least he was going to testify, that at least he was going to do something right. Reporters exploded with questions, all shouting at once, asking about evidence, about lawsuits, about other victims, about next steps. I raised my hand. I waited for silence. I said there was something else, something I hadn't mentioned yet, something that made everything worse. I picked up the phone. I projected an image using the laptop the journalist kindly offered. It was a document, a fake certificate Adrian had created 3 years ago, using my name, my supposed signature, presenting himself as a graduate in business management from a program that never existed. I explained that this document had been used to get entry-level employment, to impress investors, to build credibility. The whole story of a self-made man, of a mechanic who became a billionaire through hard work and intelligence. It was a lie, built on a forged document using the name of a piano teacher he exploited. He said he had copies, that Isabella had analyzed metadata and proven the document was created exactly when Adrian began his career at Coltech. That timing was no coincidence. That fraud lay at the very foundation of his empire. Cameras clicked. Reporters spoke into live cameras. The story unfolded in real time. It went from Miami to national, probably international. Adrian Cole wasn't just a local criminal. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with startup culture, with the adoration of billionaires, with how many crimes society forgave when a man was rich enough. But it wasn't over. There was one last revelation, bigger, more personal, more devastating. I looked directly at the main camera, CNN Live. I knew it was being broadcast. I knew Adrian was probably watching from his cell. I wanted him to hear this. She said she had perfect pitch, that she was a trained pianist with an exceptional auditory memory, that over 3 years working as a janitor at Cipriani, she had overheard conversations, dozens of them, between Adrian and partners, between Coltech executives, between lawyers discussing how to silence victims, between investors being deliberately misled about the company's financial health, and that he'd memorized it, every word, every date, every detail, because that's how my brain works, cataloging sounds, creating mental scores, and that he'd transcribed it all, page after page, conversations Adrian thought were private. That happened while an unseen janitor cleaned nearby tables. I said I had notebooks, 12 of them, 3 years of observations, and that every conversation I documented could be verified through phone records, through emails, through transactions that happened exactly when my notes said decisions were made. I saw the reporters' expressions change. This was more than history. It was an arsenal. It was a federal case constructed by a janitor with perfect pitch. It was impossible. It was unbelievable. It was perfect. Natalie added a final detail. She said she had contacted a lawyer specializing in harassment cases. That lawyer was contacting all 7 women who signed agreements, offering free representation, telling them the agreements were invalid, that they had been signed under duress, that none of them needed to remain silent any longer, and that she hoped other women would come forward. Because a pattern like that was never just 7 victims. There were always more. There were always women who never reported, who were too afraid, who thought they wouldn't be believed. But now they would be. Because 3 women from different generations had stood up, because the evidence was irrefutable, because history was everywhere, because Adrian Cole could no longer hurt anyone. The press conference lasted another hour. Questions and answers, details and clarifications, but the essence was captured. The story was told. The truth was exposed. By the time we finished, it was getting dark. It had started at 10 in the morning at Cipriani. Now it was almost 7 at night. The longest day of my life. But also the most important. Natalie offered me a ride. I accepted. We were too exhausted to drive alone. Victoria came with us. Paul and Rick went with the waiting police officer. They had to give formal statements, start legal proceedings, face their own consequences. Silence fell in the car. Comfortable, exhausted, cathartic. Natalie was driving. I was in the passenger seat. Victoria was in the back. 3 women who hadn't met a month ago, now forever linked by their decision to take down the man who hurt them all. Victoria broke the silence. She asked what we would do now, with our lives. After everything calmed down, after the trials were over, after Adrian was sentenced and the empire dissolved. Natalie said she didn't know, that for the first time in 15 years, she had no plan. That marriage to Adrian had defined her entire life, and now she was free, but also lost. But lost was better than trapped. Victoria said she would probably go to jail. Not for long. Her lawyer negotiated a plea deal, but maybe 6 months, maybe a year. She said she deserved it, that she had done wrong even under duress, but when she got out, she would rebuild. It would be better. She would work with organizations helping whistleblowers, people who expose crimes at work but fear retaliation. They looked at me, waiting for my answer. I smiled, for the first time in hours. I said I was going back to the piano, that I was going to open a new studio, but that I was also going to do something else. I was going to teach. Not just music. I was going to teach people how to document abuses in the workplace, how to use skills they already have, how to turn observation into evidence, how being invisible can become an advantage, how a janitor can bring down a billionaire if he pays attention to the right details. I was going to call it the sheet music of justice, because justice is like music. It needs timing, it needs rhythm, it needs all the right notes in the right order, and it needs someone who knows how to listen. Isabella was waiting when I got home. The door opened before I could knock. She hugged me, long, tight, crying, laughing, feeling everything at once. She said she'd seen it all. It was everywhere, every network, every news story. That I was a hero, that she was proud, that she loved me. I hugged my daughter and finally let go. All the weight, all the fear, all the anger of 3 years. It came out in sobs, in tears that hadn't fallen in too long, in tremors that shook my entire body. And Isabella held on, firmly, strongly, showing that the one who needed to protect the other had changed, that she had grown, that we were now a team, equal, survivors together. 6 months later, I sat at the piano in my new studio. It wasn't large. I rented a room in Wynwood. The walls were painted light blue. Large windows let in the sunlight. I bought a used Yamaha upright piano, but it was in perfect condition. A sign on the door read, "Score for Justice, Piano Lessons and Labor Rights Documentation." A strange combination. I knew it, but it worked. I had 12 piano students and 8 clients seeking help documenting problems at work. I taught both the same way, paying attention, identifying patterns, transforming chaos into understandable structure. Isabella came in with 2 cups of coffee. She worked with me now. She'd decided to postpone college for a year. She said she wanted to help build something real before returning to theory. I didn't argue. I understood the impulse, the need to make a tangible difference after nearly being permanently silenced. She still had a small scar on her forehead. It would probably be there forever. She didn't try to hide it. She said it was a reminder of who she was, of who I had chosen to be, the moment she decided that truth was worth more than safety. Adrian's trial had ended last week. 12 years in prison. Fraud. Embezzlement. 3 counts of harassment that women finally agreed to testify after seeing a press conference. It wasn't just 7. It was 14. 14 women he had hurt and silenced over the course of 6 years. Natalie was in the audience, sitting next to us. She and I had become unlikely friends. We had dinner every Tuesday. We talked about rebuilding, about discovering who we were without the men who had defined us. She had started volunteering at a shelter for victims of domestic violence. She said she finally understood that abuse wasn't just physical, that financial control was also imprisonment, that she had experienced a sophisticated version of what the women in that shelter experienced. The divorce proceedings were finalized. She took nothing more than what she needed to start over. The rest went to a compensation fund, to employees who had lost their pensions, to women who had been silenced. A fair division orchestrated by a judge who clearly had no patience for men like Adrian. Victoria had served 8 months. She was released last week. She came to visit me at the studio on her second day of freedom. She brought flowers. She cried. She thanked me. She said prison had been difficult but necessary, that she'd had time to think, to process, to decide who she wanted to be in the second half of her life. She'd gotten a job, a nonprofit helping whistleblowers. Exactly as she'd said she would. She used her expertise with numbers to help people document fraud. She called it redemption. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it balanced it out. It made sense of the mistake. Paul had testified. Plea bargain. No jail time, but community service and 5 years probation. He now worked at a gambling rehabilitation center as a counselor, helping other men trapped in a cycle that nearly destroyed him. He texted occasionally, thanking them, saying he was finally sleeping at night. Rick had gotten 3 years. Assault, attempted intimidation. He'd be eligible for parole in 18 months. He'd sent a letter of apology. To me, to Isabella, long, detailed, not asking for forgiveness because he knew he didn't deserve it. Just explaining, saying he understood now, that his child had been born, a girl, that he looked at her and thought of Isabella, of how he would fail as a father if he didn't fundamentally change who he was. Isabella had read the letter. She had cried, not from pain, but from something more complex. Empathy mixed with anger, mixed with cautious hope that people could change. She said that perhaps when he left, they could talk, not to forgive, but to close the circle, to allow them both to move on. Coltec had been sold, bought by a larger company that cleaned up its entire management. 53 employees kept their jobs. Another 37 received generous severance payments. Retirement funds were fully replenished, with interest, with apologies, with an external audit ensuring it would never happen again. History had become a case study. Harvard Business School, Stanford, Wharton, all teaching us about our situation, about how toxic corporate culture develops, about the importance of whistleblowers, about the power of women refusing to be silenced. I had received invitations to speak. I accepted some. Most I declined. I didn't want to be a symbol. I wanted to be human, with a normal life, with a piano, with a daughter, with peace. But sometimes she spoke, especially to groups of women, domestic workers, janitors, invisible people keeping the world running while others took credit. She said that invisibility could be a weapon, that paying attention was a superpower, that they were never too small to make a difference. Playing the piano now. Bach. Invention number 4 in D minor, fingers finding notes automatically. muscles remembering after all these years. Isabella working on the computer across the room, organizing spreadsheets for a new client. A woman reporting salary discrimination. Isabella building a case like art. Every number telling a story, every pattern revealing the truth. I looked at my daughter, 17 now, older than her years suggested, a scar on her forehead, determination in her eyes. She had decided to go back to school to study law. She wanted to be a labor lawyer, to defend people like us, like Victoria, like Paul, like everyone trapped in exploitative systems with no way out. I felt proud, not just of her, of myself too, of having survived, of having fought, of having won not just for myself, but for all who would come after. Every woman who would be heard because I refused to be silenced. Every employee who would be protected because we exposed the system. Every person who would find courage because they saw that a janitor brought down a billionaire. Adrian still wrote. From prison. Letters arrived monthly. He didn't open them. Isabella once asked if I wanted to read them. If curiosity wasn't consuming, I said no. That it didn't matter what he said now. Excuses, justifications, anger. It didn't change anything. He had chosen who he was. He had faced consequences. The story was over, but my story continued, every day, with each student learning scales, with each client learning to document injustices, with each conversation about standards and evidence and courage, transforming pain into purpose, trauma into a tool, forced silence into an amplified voice. Sometimes, cleaning the studio at the end of the day, wiping down the tables before closing, I remembered the brittle marble, the bucket of water, the moment everything changed, and I smiled. It wasn't simple happiness. It was complex satisfaction of knowing I had done something important, something lasting, something greater than personal revenge. Because my revenge wasn't just against Adrian. It was against the entire system that allows men like him to thrive. Against a culture that silences victims. Against a society that values power over justice. And against the idea that some people are too invisible to matter. I tried something different. With perfect pitch and a daughter with spreadsheets, with unlikely allies and perfect timing. With 3 years of patient observation transformed into one morning of devastating revelation. Natalie called as she was closing up the studio. She asked about dinner on Tuesday. I confirmed. She mentioned Victoria would be coming too, that it was becoming a tradition. 3 women, 3 generations, 3 survivors of the same man, dining, laughing, living lives we almost didn't have. I hung up and looked around. A small studio, but mine. An old piano, but in tune. A simple but honest life. No mansion. No fortune. He had no power in the conventional sense. But there was something better. I had a voice. I had purpose. I had a daughter who admired me instead of seeing me as a failure. I had the peace that comes from knowing that when I faced a monster, I didn't back down. That when I had the opportunity for justice, I didn't let fear stop me. And there was music. There would always be music. Fingers on the keyboard. Notes forming patterns. Patterns revealing truths. Truths setting people free. I sat at the piano one last time before heading home. I didn't plan what to play. I just let my fingers find the keys. It started as an improvisation, random notes. Then a pattern emerged. Melody, harmony, rhythm. It was new, an original composition. I'd never played it before, but it flowed naturally, as if it had been inside me all along, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Isabella stopped working. She listened. When I finished, she had tears in her eyes. She asked the name of the song. I smiled. She said she didn't know yet, that she needed time to decide, but that it captured the journey. Beginning in C minor, dark, heavy, desperate, moving through tension and dissonance, finally resolving in C major, clear, luminous, free. Isabella suggested a title. The Score of Revenge. No, I shook my head. It wasn't about revenge. Revenge implies equality, becoming as bad as the one who hurt you. This wasn't revenge. It was justice. It was restoration. It was alchemy transforming pain into power. So what name? She insisted. I thought. I looked at the studio, at the piano, at my daughter, at the life we rebuilt from the ashes, at all the women we helped, at all the women we would still help. The symphony of the invisible, he finally said, because that was true. The invisible are not powerless. They are just underestimated. And when they decide to be seen, when they decide to be heard, when they decide their story deserves to be told, they change the world, one note at a time, one pattern at a time, one life at a time. And me, Elena Reyes, caretaker, pianist, mother, woman who refused to be silenced. I would keep playing. I would keep teaching. I would keep proving that no matter how invisible society tries to make you, you always have power. You always have a voice. You always have a choice. Choose to kneel or stand. Choose to be silent or speak. Choose to accept or fight. I chose to fight, and I won. Not just for me, for all of us. If you're listening to this right now, if you're in a similar situation, if you feel invisible, forgettable, powerless, remember, pay attention, document everything, find allies, wait for the right moment. And when it arrives, when the timing is perfect, when all the pieces are aligned, don't hesitate, act, because you are stronger than you think, more important than anyone says, more powerful than anyone imagines. And your story, your truth, your justice, deserves to be heard, loud, clear, impossible to ignore. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, like it, share it with someone who needs to hear that invisibility isn't weakness. Comment with your own story of overcoming. Thank you for listening, for bearing witness, for believing that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they decide they've suffered enough. See you next time.